Hello, everybody. Tim here. I'm going to do my benchmark discussion on social justice. And so let's jump right into number one. Question number one. Discuss my understanding of how cultural humility, cultural awareness, advocacy, and social justice are important in the counseling profession. Well, to be honest with everybody, I actually, and not to go down the rabbit hole immediately, but I really struggle with the subject of social justice because it is commonly spun in a political way to make privilege seem like a prejudiced intersectionality between who's privileged and who's marginalized. And if you can tell, I'm a white bald guy and I tend to vote conservatively and I ride a motorcycle, and so I tend to fall into a stereotypical trap with people. And I don't consider myself racist. I don't consider myself privileged in a racial way. So I kind of reject those political positions. And so usually when I hear the word social justice or I read about it, there's some hesitancy to accept it. And so reading this week in chapter 5, I really struggled. Honestly, I read this chapter for 3 days over and over and over again. And I'm still, at this point, I'm really not totally on board with the MSJCC model, the praxis model, the four quadrants discussing privilege and marginalization and how they intersect. I really have a hard time understanding it. I really actually don't accept this kind of intersectionality that occurs between relationships with people. It's hard for me to see. And perhaps, people in a political posture would say, well, that's racist, and that is, what's the word they it's like I'm unaware of my racism, and it's an evidence of my privilege. I don't really know what to feel about that. Obviously, that's part of critical race theory and part of critical legal studies and problematizing my character, assassinating my character. So I don't think that I believe that, but again, I could always be wrong. So I'm open to learning. So if someone could explain social justice to me, I welcome that. I read books all the time. I've read professors' positions on it. I've watched many TED Talks. I've been open to it for years as it's made its way into the forefront of the media and politics. And in any case, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole any further on it, but I just struggled this week taking that textbook information into my heart, taking it for what it is. But I think social justice as a subject is not only to a political spin, like Christ demonstrated social justice when he died for everybody. And I'll get into that as we keep talking here. But I think overall, not to get political about it, but cultural humility, cultural awareness, and advocacy and social justice are important in the counseling profession because we're there for the client. We are there to advocate for them. As chapter 8 talked about in Simmons and Kuhnley, that the therapeutic relationship is only for the client. In fact, it's not supposed to be mutually beneficial. It's supposed to be that we are offering a service, we're offering a product to help the client. We're not here to help ourselves and to affirm our own beliefs. We're supposed to be building up that client so that they can reach their goals or their defined goals, or that the goals that we help them define through their lens and through their cultural lens. So that's our job. Number 2, your understanding of the ethical principles regarding cultural humility, awareness, advocacy, and social justice. In chapter 6, I wrote notes about this because I can't keep it all in my brain. In chapter 6 of Simmons and Kuhnley, this goes into depth about the 6 ethical principles. And to quote from the textbook, the 6 ethical principles guide our practice. They do not give directives because maintaining the client's autonomy is a measure of respect for the client's differences. and not to impose our own views on or directives onto them. And that's a paraphrase, but Simmons et al. 2020. I think autonomy is an important ethical pillar in the ethical principles regarding humility and cultural awareness and advocacy. Autonomy is important, and that reinforces the ACA Code of Ethics provision that we learned earlier weeks ago, that we're not supposed to be impressing our worldview and our impressions and our beliefs onto the client. We're supposed to be scaffolding and encouraging their own autonomy so that we're not impressing upon them what we think, what we feel. Our job is to approach them and help them understand their thoughts and feelings and allow them to experience as much autonomy as possible, and because that's ethically our job. I like that the textbook says in chapter 5 and 6, I'm not exactly sure what chapter it's in, but I like that Simmons and Kuhnley describe that when you have a client in the room with you, they're the expert and I'm the one learning. And that's kind of a reverse idea. You could say that, well, aren't I supposed to be the one giving direction and giving guidance to a person? Aren't I supposed to know more about science and research and research-based practice and theory and principle? I might have acquired those knowledges, but the attitude that I'm supposed to be adopting is that client is what I need to learn. Basically, every client that walks through the door is a new person. It's a new unit, if you will. It's a whole entire new system of experiences and worldviews and lifestyles. And so to be culturally humble is to take and to adopt this attitude that they're the expert of their own culture, and I shouldn't be making the mistake of assuming that I understand them, whether they're a certain race or a certain religion or a certain lifestyle like homosexuality, or whether they're single or a divorcee or a soccer mom or whatever stereotype you might assume that they fit into. Don't make that false assumption. It's a logical fallacy. Number 3, at least one Bible verse or spiritual quotation that supports the importance of cultural awareness and humility and social justice. This was in the textbook, but before I actually read it in the textbook, it's what was on my mind, and that's Matthew 28, verses 19, and that's Christ's great commission to the disciples. Go and make disciples of all nations. Christ didn't die on the cross just for Jewish people. He didn't die on the cross just for white people or, British people or anyone else on the planet. He died for everyone. And the Great Commission is there because Christ's grace doesn't end at Israel and Jerusalem and the Jewish people. Like Christ and God, they don't care about Jewish tradition as much as they care about saving people. And the textbook talks about that in chapter 6, I believe, as well. Or chapter 5, for Christ being the model of cultural humility and social justice. And the greatest justice is that he came and abolished all of the societal systems that the world had established, because he put everyone under this sinful nature umbrella. Therefore, you need a savior. God's grace is available for you. Accept Christ. And that was the greatest justice that was ever served, was that Christ died for sin. So if we adopt that model as well, that, Christ died for everyone. He didn't judge anyone. He hung out with tax collectors and Samaritans. And I think that we should adopt that same model, that people who walk in my door and I'll be counseling, they're not going to have my worldview. They're not going to have my feelings and my perspective and even my faith. But I don't require that of them in order to serve them. They're worth helping, just like I've been worth dying for on the cross. So there's a parallel there that can't really be avoided when you look at the example of Christ. Okay, number 4, an action you'll take to develop or demonstrate cultural humility with clients. An action, well, I went and did some research on this to get my source in here, but also to learn. And I found an article from 2020, so last year, and this is from the Department of National Rehabilitation Counseling Association. I didn't know they existed. Seems like a pretty cool organization. They did a study on who identify as LGBTQ in vocational rehab, and they kind of did like a psychoanalytical and emotional study. And so they identified that terminology and pronoun usage is really important in this population. And so I'll just quote from the article a bit. Okay, so the importance, right, so this is on the point of the importance of being aware that if you have a homosexual person or a any acronym, you pick any of the acronyms in the LGBTQ plus, that thing keeps going on every year. We add more acronyms onto it. But the whole point is that you have someone in your room who's different than you are. Pronouns are important and terminology is important to them. Might not be what you agree with. It's actually not what I agree with, but it's important to them. And so if I'm advocating for them, it's important to me to understand. So to quote from the article, they say, the term cisgender refers to the alignment of one's gender identity with their biological sex, i.e. male or female. As it pertains to those who identify as LGBTQ+, however, this is not necessarily the case. Some individuals do not present biologically as they identify cognitively or emotionally, and gender is perceived as a spectrum rather than binary, which means, obvious. If you look at me, you would say I look like a man. You could say that. Until I tell you I'm a man or admit that I feel emotionally like a man or that biologically I accept that I am a man, don't make the false assumption. And that's basically the point they're saying, is that if my social culture is that I look like a man, I'm bald, I'm white, but I don't identify as a man, they're basically saying that don't fall for that false assumption, because it could be offensive to someone, and obviously having that conflict is not a good thing in the counseling relationship. We want to be advocating for our clients. We want to be advocates of social justice for our clients. So an action to demonstrate or develop cultural humility with an LGBTQ client is to, well, this is actually question 4 and 5 are kind of together. The actions to advocate and engage in social justice and the actions to develop and demonstrate cultural humility. They're kind of two of the same thing. The cultural humility of this is that what I think about gender and pronouns isn't important. It's what the client thinks and how they want to be identified. That's what's important. And it's important for me to be culturally humble to that, because as the textbook described, they're the expert of their culture, not me. So whether or not I agree with it or not doesn't matter. I don't need to go home at night and believe my client or to adopt their perspective into my life. That's not required. But what is required ethically is that I can accept them as they are, and I can address them and respect them as they are. That's cultural humility. The slightly different vantage point is how to advocate for social justice for those client populations. And there was a great example used in chapter 5 by Dr. Melvin, the video at the end. and he discussed a time when he was working with a client at a Christian counseling practice, and he had assumed that the person he was working with was a Christian. Well, he learned after, and these are his words, in a couple months, Dr. Melvin, that the client was actually a Muslim. And so they had a conflict between Christ and Allah. And Dr. Melvin admitted that it would have been better to, when they had started their relationship together, to discover that. And so I think an action to advocate for social justice with an LGBTQ plus client is to actually ask them, how would you, or how do you identify, or how would you prefer to be identified? I think that's a really easy and honest way to not impress my views on the client and not to make a mistake of an assumption. So yeah, that is in my notes as well. Just do not assume. Do not make an assumption, because it can harm a client and it can fracture the relationship that you're trying to build. And I think the textbook also makes a really great point about the whole point of social justice, the whole point of advocacy and awareness is to develop and build the therapeutic alliance. I want the person in the room to feel as safe and as accepted as they can be. And I want to encourage their autonomy as much as possible. And that's part of the ethical principle of this as well that we talked about. So yeah, I think that wraps up the questions here in this unit. Thank you for listening. And if you have any comments, please leave them below. Thank you for getting this far. I'll talk to you all soon.